Philosophic Critiques of Locke, Rousseau and Hegel, Lecture 3. In the last lecture, I talked about Rousseau and a few ideas of Rousseau's that will indirectly feed into later progressive thought. One of those being the fact that for Rousseau, the state of nature represents a state of primitive humanity that really doesn't have much to teach us about politics. Politics is really a realm of human culture, and it's something that develops over the course of human history, and the state of nature by itself is a very primitive state from which we have not that much to learn about politics. Beyond that, we also saw that Rousseau and Rousseau's notion of perfectibility, or the faculty of self-perfection, is an important contributor to the notion that we human beings are kind of more the product of institutions and the product of history, and that nature does not provide us much guidance generally in terms of how to live or what we should be. And so that a lot of what is distinctively human is stuff that's developed over time, over history, and really in a way can be seen to be a product of socialization or a product of history rather than a product of nature. And that's something that definitely will contribute to subsequent progressive thought. And then finally, we saw, especially in his social contract, the way that for Rousseau, the problem of politics is really the problem of the preservation of freedom than it is the protection of natural rights. Rousseau doesn't really take a natural law approach. He doesn't see natural rights as providing limits to government. He doesn't see the protection of natural rights as the purpose of government. He sees the purpose of government as the preservation of freedom, and in that way, hopefully to enable what he calls moral freedom, or what we nowadays would call autonomy, the capacity to give ourselves our own laws, since nature on its own does not. Now, in this lecture, we get to the thought of Hegel. And Hegel was born in 1770. He died in 1831. He had an enormous influence in Germany. And also, he had quite a bit of influence on the thought of the first generation of American progressive thinkers in the mid to late 1800s, partly because some of Hegel's students, some progressive thinkers actually did graduate studies in Germany, where they took classes with Hegel's students, people who had been formed by Hegel. And also some people who'd been influenced by Hegel in Germany came over to the United States. There's actually even a character, for those of you who are familiar with the book Little Women, the German professor that ends up marrying Jo. There's a passage in Little Women that talks about how he would sometimes talk to her about the philosophy of Hegel and how she found it totally incomprehensible. And that makes Jo really not that much different from almost everybody who's read Hegel, because Hegel, as you probably noticed even from the very brief selections that I gave you, is an extremely difficult and obscure philosopher who nonetheless had a great deal of influence. Now, I gave you just a couple pages of selections from his philosophy of history and his philosophy of right. His book, The Philosophy of Right, is really his political philosophy proper. But now Hegel, in a certain sense, you could say Hegel is the original progressive, in the sense that Hegel is the philosopher that gives the strongest defense, or the most concerted defense, of the claim that human history is not ruled by accident or chance, but really that human history is a rational process. And not only is human history a rational process of development, human history constitutes progress, in the sense that this rational process over history is a progressive process in the improvement of the human spirit. As he says at the beginning of the Philosophy of History selections I gave you, this is on page 173 of your packet, the only thought which philosophy brings with it to the contemplation of history is the simple conception of reason, that reason is the sovereign of the world, that the history of the world, therefore, presents us with a rational process. And although I forgot to put it, and as he says at the end of the first big paragraph on page 174, the history of the world is none other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom, a progress whose development, according to the necessity of its nature, it is our business to investigate. So history is a rational process wherein human beings become progressively more free. You can see that connection with Rousseau there, the way that reason is that freedom is so important. Um, so this I only gave you just a few selections from how this process works. Um, and to begin with, for Hegel, though, what this means then is that it doesn't really make sense for Hegel to say that human beings are by nature free. And in the sense that he, like Rousseau, does not believe, well, I shouldn't say it's complicated, the relationship with Rousseau, but like Rousseau, he believes that if you're going to talk about the state of nature of human beings, what you're talking about is our original or most primitive condition. And much like Rousseau, Hegel does not believe that in our most primitive condition, human beings are really rational yet. And insofar as they are not rational yet, they are not truly free. But rather that our understanding of freedom and our capacity to be free as individuals and as societies develops over time as different cultures throughout world history kind of make additions to the human capacity to be free before kind of passing it on to other ones. And he divides up the stages of world history into kind of three main stages. And the first stage is the stage of the Oriental world. That's the translation here. And by Oriental world, Hegel is referring primarily to China and India, and then ancient Mesopotamia, including, say, Babylon and the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire is the last great representative of the Oriental world. And the Oriental world is characterized for him by despotism in the sense of the absolute rule of the one, right? The emperor, somebody like Cyrus in Persia or something like that, pharaohs, despots. Talks about this on 173 to 174, right? The Orientals have not attained the knowledge that spirit, man as such, is free. And because they do not know this, they are not free. They only know that one is free, namely the emperor, the pharaoh. But on this very account, the freedom of that one is only caprice, it's arbitrary, ferocity, brutal recklessness, or passion, or a mildness and tameness of the desires, which is of itself only an accident of nature, mere caprice, like the former. That one is therefore only a despot, not a free man. So in the Oriental world, one is free. But in that sense, it's not really meaningful freedom. It just means that there's one person who has the arbitrary power to do whatever he wants. But Hegel does not believe that having the power to do whatever you want is what makes you free. If you're governed by passion as opposed to reason, you're not really free. So that's the first step, is the Oriental world. And then Hegel sees in the historical process when the Greeks defeat the Persians, right, in the Persian War, this is kind of the passing of the historical baton from the Oriental world to the ancient Mediterranean world, where the next stage in the progress of human freedom occurs with the Greeks and the Romans. And this is, these are the places where you have the birth of conceptions such as rule of law and equal citizenship. And so it marks some progress in the sense that instead of just one, the despot, being free, in the Greek and Roman world, some are free. The citizens are free, right? As he says, the consciousness of freedom first arose among the Greeks, and therefore they were free. But they, and the Romans likewise, knew only that some are free, not man as such. The fact that human beings are essentially free because rational beings, that's not yet recognized in Greek thought or institutions. As he says, even Plato and Aristotle did not know this. The Greeks therefore had slaves, and their whole life and the maintenance of their splendid liberty was implicated with the institution of slavery. So only some are free, but slavery is still admitted as legitimate in the Greek world. And this shows that they don't have a fully worked out understanding of the fact that human beings as rational beings are entitled to be free, to live in free institutions. So in the same way that having just one person, the despot, free, is not a proper understanding of freedom, neither is only allowing some people to be free a proper understanding of reason. Since to enslave somebody for Hegel is in essence to kind of deny their full human nature, to deny them their rational right to govern themselves. As he also says in the Philosophy of History, not in a selection that I give you, there's also no liberty of conscience in the ancient world. And that's another mark of the fact that freedom is not fully understood by the Greeks. But then you get to the modern world. And here, this is at the top of page 174, he talks about the German nations. That's a little bit, this is a 19th century translation that is an imperfect translation. It shouldn't be the German nations, like specifically the Teutons. He's talking here about the Germanic nations. So namely, the barbarians, the people who overthrew the Roman Empire, right? So the predecessors of what becomes Western Europe, Spain, France, Germany, England, the Scandinavian countries. Those are all Germanic peoples. So he's talking about kind of the barbarians, because in the Roman world, Christianity is kind of born in the Roman world, but really comes to fruition, according to Hegel, in the Germanic nations in Western Europe. As he says at the top of page 174, the Germanic nations, under the influence of Christianity, were the first to attain the consciousness that man as man is free, that it is the freedom of spirit which constitutes its essence. This consciousness first arose in religion, the inmost region of spirit. But to introduce the principle into the various relations of the actual world involves a more extensive problem than its simple implementation, a problem whose solution and application require a severe and lengthened process of culture. In proof of this, we may note that slavery did not cease immediately on the reception of Christianity. Still less did liberty predominate in states, or governments and constitutions adopt a rational organization or recognize freedom as their basis. The application of the principle to political relations, the thorough molding and interpenetration of the constitution of society by it, is a process identical with history itself. Okay, a little bit of a translation. So the essential freedom of humanity is first recognized in Christianity, recognized in this notion that every person is a child of God, every person is fallen, but every person is redeemed. And that, in that sense, in our call to sanctity, in the universal call to sanctity, human beings are all equal and free in spirit. And what he means is, even though the essential freedom of humanity is first recognized in religion, it's not really spread to other social institutions, right? So as he says, even as Christianity spreads, you still have slavery, you still have tyrannical government, you still have aristocracy, you still have various kinds of unequal or irrational social institutions that deny people freedom in the actual world. So this is why he says it takes a process of culture, that kind of the idea of freedom, the seed of the idea of freedom is planted in Christianity, but it takes centuries and centuries of cultural and civilizational development for that notion of freedom to spread to the rest of society, to find its expression in political institutions, to find its expression in familial institutions, to find its expression in legal institutions and in the culture. So you could say that kind of the history of Western Europe for Hegel is the unfolding of this realization that human beings are rational and free. So it begins with Christianity, it spreads through the Enlightenment until finally you end up with kind of the basic architecture of political institutions that recognize the equal dignity and equal freedom of all citizens. And that's why he says the history of the world is none other than the progress in the consciousness of freedom. Historical progress takes the form of human cultures over time coming to understand better what it means to be free and how to build social institutions that recognize and nurture that freedom. That's Hegel's notion. So this is why I say he's kind of like the original progressive in this regard, because this is historical progress of the highest sort. Now, what this means then also is that, somewhat like Calhoun, Hegel rejects the claim that the state of nature, which is to say our original primitive state, is a state of freedom. This is one of the errors that he diagnoses. This is in the second section on page 174, where he says, the error which first meets us is the direct contradictory of our principle that the state presents the realization of freedom. Now, let me stop there for a second, because as we'll see, for Hegel, the development of freedom requires the development of political institutions. That it is actually living in the state, living in a political community, that people learn how to be free. So that's what he means by saying that the state presents the realization of freedom. That's where you're truly and become truly and fully capable of being free, is under rational political institutions. So again, as he says, the error which first meets us is the direct contradictory of our principle that the state presents the realization of freedom. The opinion, that is, that man is free by nature, but that in society, in the state, to which nevertheless he is irresistibly impelled, he must limit his natural freedom. Right? He rejects this notion that in the state of nature we are free, and that we actually give up some of our freedom when we join civil society. He says, no. In fact, in the state of nature, we are very much unfree, and our capacity to be free develops when we join civil society. As he says, that man is free by nature is quite correct in one sense, namely that he is so according to the idea of humanity, that in our essence we are free. But we imply thereby, that lie. I'm sorry, my translation is garbled. To correct the typo in the translation, what he should be read as saying is, but we imply thereby that he is such only in virtue of his destiny, that he has an undeveloped power to become such. So in other words, we are by nature free in the sense that we are destined to develop the capacity to be free. But if by the state of nature you mean our original condition, the primary and original and first condition of mankind, then it is not the case to say that we're free. Because, as he says, the state of nature in terms of our primitive state is a state of injustice and violence, of untamed natural impulses, of inhuman deeds and feelings. That's at the top of page 175. So in other words, our primitive condition, our original natural condition, is one of arbitrariness, of unruled passion, unjust action, not a state of freedom. And this is why he argues, and the progressives will follow him in this, that, strictly speaking, it's not true to say that when we join society, we have to give up some of our natural freedom in order to preserve the rest. That's the social contract view, right? We give up some of our liberties in order to preserve the rest. Rather, it is only by joining society that human beings can become free, can become truly and rationally free. As he says on page 175, where he says, society and the state are the very conditions in which freedom is realized. And again, this is for reasons somewhat similar to what Rousseau was talking about when Rousseau talks about civil freedom and natural freedom. That for Hegel as for Rousseau, in our primitive condition, we're basically governed by instinct and passion, not reason. The joining of society is one of the primary, living within society is one of the primary ways in which human beings learn how to act not on impulse, not on instinct, but to act on the basis of reason, to think about how we ought to act and to act in accordance with that. So insofar as for Hegel, to be free is to act in accordance with reason and not be ruled by our passions, it follows that since joining society and living under government and law is one of the things that helps us to live on the basis of principles instead of on the basis of instinct, that therefore joining society is necessary in order to learn to be free. You do not give up freedom when you join society. The state is necessary for freedom to emerge. So this means, as for Hegel, in a way, as for Locke, to be free does not mean to be able to do just whatever you want. To be free means to be rational, to be able to control yourself and act in accordance with the dictates of reason. And Hegel denies that human beings naturally have the capacity to live this way. We have the potential to become rational, but we must join society. We must be formed over time, over history, by culture in order to sort of learn how to be rational. And this is somewhat similar to what Calhoun talks about, as you might recall. Right? This idea that the amount of liberty that people are entitled to depends upon their capacity. And the capacity that a particular people has to be free is partly based on the institutions they have and the kind of historical development that they've passed through. And so hence the limitations placed on human beings in society, the laws and all that kind of stuff, are not really limitations of freedom at all. They're limitations of instinct, they're limitations of appetite. But actually, by limiting our ability to act spontaneously on our appetites, it's making us more capable of acting on the basis of reason. And that's what makes us free. Now, this also kind of shows why Hegel doesn't really talk in terms of natural rights, because if nature is associated with primitive beginnings, then it's not really the case that there's anything that we possess by nature that's worth having a right to, right, in the sense of natural rights. All of the various rights that human beings have are things that are historically realized over time. It takes, as Rousseau said, it takes a long time to develop concepts such as good, right, wrong, just, unjust, property, and all those kinds of things. So all the various rights that we as free and rational beings are entitled to aren't strictly speaking natural rights, because we don't have any conception of them in the state of nature. They're human rights. They're rights that develop over time as the human race progresses. Now, remember, for Locke, we by nature have the right to our lives, but also the right to use our bodies and exercise our talents. And in that sense, we also have a right to the fruits of our labors. And so our various talents and capacities are conceived of as our natural property. And then the state, civil society, is understood to develop in order to protect those natural goods, to protect our faculties, to protect our property, to protect our liberty. And Hegel thinks that's the wrong way to go about thinking of it. The various talents and capacities that we have must be developed. They must be cultivated. And they can be developed only within society. Outside of society, they would lay dormant, and we would live a very rudimentary and primitive way of life. Right? Calhoun makes a similar argument, right? In order to develop our humanity, our highest human potentials, we must be socialized. And that means that we depend for our freedom on society, which gives us the conditions within which to develop our talents and capacities. Right? And that's very important. That's another way, as with Rousseau, of this kind of idea that in a certain sense, what we are isn't really a product of nature. That which is most distinctively human is really a product of culture, a product of history, a product of circumstance. Nature just gives raw materials. But so what that means is our talents aren't really ours by nature, and so we don't have a natural right to them. The cultivation of our talents presupposes living in society, and therefore it doesn't make sense to think here that you have an individual right necessarily to exercise your talents, because your very ability to cultivate and exercise those talents presupposes social cooperation. So Hegel does not conclude from this that therefore we have no rights. Hegel's not a socialist or a communist or anything like that, but he denies that we have natural rights. It's not the case that we have certain individual rights by nature that society simply must respect. It's more complicated than that, because our development is dependent upon our social life. Now, the social contract theory of government assumes that human beings can be fully human without living under government, and that society can be deliberately created by the agreement of pre-social individuals. Calhoun had already rejected this. Hegel rejects it as well. Hegel rejects completely the notion that society is based on a social contract. He talks about that on page 177. Where he says the result of that way of thinking is that it reduces the union of individuals in the state to a contract, and therefore to something based on their arbitrary wills, their opinion, and their capriciously given express consent. Right? So in other words, To think of that society is based on a contract is to think that society is optional, that whether a society exists and what rights and duties government has, that's all just dependent upon what people happen to agree to. And he says, no, insofar as we are destined to become free, insofar as we are essentially rational creatures, it follows from this that the powers of the state and the origin of the state, the purposes of the state, can be derived by reason and do not depend for their legitimacy on the fact that people happen to agree to them. So he doesn't believe that the powers of government must be derived from the consent of the governed. Why should government necessarily be based on consent, especially if we're not naturally free, right? The whole reason why government had to be based on consent for the founders was because we were conceived of as being naturally free and needing to voluntarily lay aside our natural freedom in order to join society. But if the state is what makes it possible for us to be free, and therefore if we are not naturally free, then why should the state require consent in order to come into existence? Right? Basing society on consent requires the notion that by nature human beings are free, and Hegel denies this. Human beings need the state in order to become free, as I've said many times. Society and the state are the very conditions in which freedom is realized. Page 173. And this means that the legitimacy of government is derived from its rationality, from the fact that it makes good and rational laws, and not from the fact that a majority of the people who live under it somehow give their consent to it. So Hegel, this makes it possible for, monarchies to be legitimate for Hegel, even if they're not based on consent. What matters is not who gave permission, but whether the government actually governs in a rational way that respects people's freedom. Now, it should be noted, therefore, that Hegel is not against consent either. He's not saying that he's not defending dictatorship. He's just saying that the consent of the government is not a necessary condition for legitimate governmental power. When you read his philosophy of right, and he read, widely, you'll see that he is actually a proponent of kind of vigorous local government of a sort that would seem strange to us. But nonetheless, he believed that some degree of political participation in self-government was very, very important, in the same way that he was also a defender of free markets. He read a lot of Adam Smith and stuff. So Hegel's not really an authoritarian. He just doesn't think that consent is necessary for government to be legitimate. And he also thinks that there should be a class of kind of expert bureaucrats that sort of oversee society to make sure that things are done in a rational manner. And that's why, right, if the most important thing is for government to be rational in the laws that it makes, then the government must depend upon kind of professional civil servants who will know what the best laws or regulations might be. He talks about this quite a bit in the Philosophy of Right. I didn't really give you any of those selections, so you're going to have to take my word for it. But nonetheless, Hegel is a major source of the belief that scientifically trained professionals ought to regulate various areas of society for the good of all. And in that sense, he would call for more administrative centralization than somebody like Tocqueville would be comfortable with, because Hegel believes that, in a lot of areas of governing, there is a certain way to get things right, and so you should depend upon the people who know how to do things right. You should rely on experts, because politicians and ordinary people oftentimes lack the requisite knowledge and qualifications to know what would make for a good regulation or a good law. Like your average citizen can't necessarily come up with good regulations for the stock market, for example. It's a very complex thing. So Hegel is kind of at the forefront of a way of thinking about government that calls for a professionalization of bureaucrats. You should have really kind of rigorous training for all the people who are going to work for the government. And these professionally trained civil servants should have quite a bit more power to regulate society for the good of all. It's not because Hegel hates freedom or something. He just thinks that in many areas the experts know better. Excuse me. And so this is also why, therefore, Hegel kind of lays the groundwork for a way of thinking which says, that true freedom actually requires a more expansive form of government that sort of legislates in more areas than, say, Locke or the founders would have called for. That he doesn't really think that kind of strictly limited government, the notion that the purpose of government is to protect you from harm. He thinks that's a too minimal conception. And in that sense, Aristotle returns in some ways back to a more Aristotelian conception, where he thinks that government has a broader role to play in shaping society so that people can live good lives. So it's not just about preventing harm, it's about enabling people to live better. And that's going to have a big influence on the progressives, because American progressives are going to be very critical of the founders, because they thought that the founders had too restricted of an idea of the purpose of government. They had a too narrow idea, as though the purpose of government is simply to prevent harm, and it doesn't have other positive tasks for cultivating quality of life. Hegel has that same criticism. And in fact, on pages 175 and 176, you see his brief criticism of America, where he basically says America is extremely materialistic and individualistic, and government and the law just seems to be basically there to protect people in their private pursuit of wealth, right? And so the state exists solely to protect individuals in their private pursuit of profit and gain, and to protect them from harm. And that's just too narrow. And he also thinks that American religion is really crazy, but we won't get into that. But so you can see how he has this idea that America is too materialistic, too individualistic, has too narrow and low a view of the purpose of government, whereas he thinks insofar as government is there in order to ensure that a society is rationally structured so that people can live free lives where they can develop their full human potential, that requires that government do a lot more. And we will see that theme come up again and again with American progressives and liberals. And in the next set of lectures, we will talk about an important early liberal political scientist by the name of Charles Merriam, who does a very good job of summarizing the critiques that the first generation of American progressives had of the founding principles, as well as sort of he lays out in a brief way the alternative that the progressives proposed.